A warm welcome to our next keynote speaker, Tom Friend, who will dive into how the principles of agility have been instrumental in shaping the trajectory of aerospace exploration in his presentation on Agile Innovation in Aerospace. As the industry grapples with escalating complexity and dwindling resources, the adoption of agile and analogous methodologies has become imperative. Be sure to join Tom immediately after the session for a live Q&A.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Tom Friend. My presentation is entitled Agile Innovation in Aerospace. In this presentation, we will explore several dimensions of agility in the path of discovery in flight and aerospace exploration. My background. I'm an Agile coach currently working in the banking industry in Charlotte, North Carolina. I have a couple of decades of experience working with various sized teams. Fun fact about me is I was also a military pilot in my past, in both the Navy and Air Force. And for that, I always have to recognize my wife because I could never have had such success without her. This presentation is a conversation about 4 case studies. I will present a case study and then ask a question. The case studies are as follows. Agile in the history of manned flight. Agile innovation at the Skunk Works. NASA agility with faster, better, cheaper. And the modern revolution of CubeSat open source in outer space. So what is agility? Agility is a property consisting of quickness, lightness, and ease of movement. Fast response to sudden changes, quickly reprioritizing your resources, and incremental and iterative delivery. Organizations that embrace agility are able to maximize business value with right size, just enough, just in time processes and documentation. There are many agile frameworks and practices. The one I will draw your attention to is Scrum, which is credited to launching the modern agile development movement. Interestingly, Scrum has its roots in aviation. Jeff Sutherland was one of the co-creators of Scrum. He flew jets in the Air Force during Vietnam. As a fighter pilot, he was trained in the OODA loop, which is an iterative feedback process loop of observe, orient, decide, and act. Along with energy maneuverability theory and the conservation of energy, all of this went into the creation of Scrum. Dr. Sutherland applied continuous improvement to inspect and adapt, which is referred to as Kaizen, into a feedback loop to take prioritized items in a backlog to deliver incremental value to the customer. An interesting history of agility in aviation. So let's transition into the case studies now. I will lead with a quote. Edmund Burke once said, "Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it." I'd paraphrase this as if you don't inspect and adapt, you're not going to learn from your mistakes, and more importantly, the mistakes of others. So, aviation has a rich history of failure. First, Icarus did not listen to his father Daedalus and flew too close to the sun, and his wings of wax melted and he fell to his death. Then there were the Chinese military kites that had ridiculous failure. An observer flying over the enemy territory, the wind stops at the kite, and he gently floats down behind enemy lines. Balloons also had a bumpy track record. Madame Blanchard landed her hydrogen balloon on a top of a flue, which burst into flame. Actually, she goes down as the first person to crash and burn in aviation history. It wasn't, though, until Otto Lilienthal and his experimentation with gliders did people begin to think and take notice. The Wright brothers were some of those who took great interest. So when the Wright brothers went to the Smithsonian Institute and asked for information about aeronautics, they recommended this book, Progress in Flying Machines by Octave Chanute. He was a railway engineer of all things, and in 1894, he published this book. And in it, he documented 400 years of failed aviation experiments. It was grouped in three areas: wings and parachutes, screws that lift, and aeroplanes. From this, the Wright brothers reflected on success and failures of those who went before them. Some of the lessons that they learned are as follows. First lesson: get it right before rollout. Many of man's early attempts to fly involved flapping wings. One such attempt was made by a gentleman named Mr. Degan in 1812. It sounds like a pretty successful device, but when Octave offers an extra bit of information, it's rather humorous. Uh, Basically, what he says, he failed to mention one important addition. He put a small balloon on his back, which helped raise him into the air. Later on, he was attacked by disappointed spectators and beaten unmercifully and was laughed at afterwards. The lesson here is to be careful and honest in our experiments, and we don't want to have too much hot air attached to it. Just fun to mention that. The next lesson was make your failures small enough to learn and recover from. So, de Groot built a device in 1864, and it was essentially a parachute. And it didn't work too well for him. He got on top of a very, very high building, jumped off, and plummeted to his death. Uh, in the book, the guidance was perhaps an experiment with a sandbag and a small model would have saved his life. And the next lesson was try to stay away from big project failure. So Gerard, or Mr. Gerard, built a aerial locomotive. Boy, I wish I could have been there for this one. This aerial locomotive had tremendous power, steam boilers, and it started to flap and jump around, and they thought it was going great. So pile on more coal, make this steam, more steam to make it go, and it exploded. And the classic Big Bang project failure here. The next lesson was from Mr. Moy, and I'll call this no risk, no reward. So Mr. Moy built a very elegant flying machine. In fact, if you looked at it aerodynamically, it might have succeeded. It was a self-funded project, and he tested it on a flat surface with no headwind. Perhaps had he taken the risk or leaned forward and gone down a hill or launched it into a headwind, he could have been the one in the history books. But he never pushed the envelope. The next lesson was keep it simple, keep it small, experimental, and successful. So now we're getting somewhere. This is an example of a simple, small experiment that came out of Germany. It was in the 1870s that a bunch of engineers started making small aircraft that were powered by rubber bands that demonstrated important principles about center of gravity, lift, thrust, and maneuverability. Being small and simple, they could test, fail, and move on. This is where the Wright brothers adopted their experimental philosophy. So they started out from this book and walked away and said, what we're going to do is a campaign of experiments. Because if you try to do too much in a single experiment, it greatly increases your probability of failure. So you want to keep it simple, don't be overly ambitious, and waste time, talent, and resources. So the Wright brothers, they built a model. Then they built a big model. And then they put a person in the model. And then they gave the big model with a person a push down a hill. The Wright brothers in 1903 were self-funded, no formal education, lived in obscurity, dismissed by the Smithsonian, ignored by the media, and were supported by unpaid volunteers. The first flight, putting this into perspective, was less than the wingspan of the aircraft that I flew in the Air Force. So I'm going to shift gears here and talk about a contemporary of the Wright brothers, Samuel Langley. He was a contemporary of the Wright brothers working to master powered flight. He was well funded, had a team of PhDs and engineers. He had the support of the War Department. He was followed by the media. I mean, think tabloids. He was a big deal. And he had all the backing from the Smithsonian that you could ever ask for. So he built a model and then built a full-size aircraft and put it on a houseboat on the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. Then he invited everyone out to see the first big flight. And the aircraft dove into the river. And that must have been very embarrassing for him, but it was a complete failure. So, question: why did the Wright brothers succeed where Samuel Langley did not? Let's continue. When the why is clear, the how is easy. So let's transition to our next question that reflects on agility at the Skunk Works. All right, the Skunk Works is an unofficial name for the advanced development programs. Uh, the Skunk Works are responsible for a number of really famous aircraft. The U-2 SR-71, the F-117, and F-35, which I'm going to go over with you in the next few slides. So the U-2 Dragon Lady requirements were fly really high, take pictures, and don't get shot down. So in 1955, the Skunk Works got a contract from the CIA to build this spy plane. And they built it in a couple of months. And it was tested in Groom Lake out in Nevada. And it was flying by 1956. It was great and was working wonderfully until it ceased operations when it was shot down in a mission in 1960 while over Russia. Clearly, the requirements had changed. So the next reconnaissance aircraft was the SR-71 Blackbird. And their requirements were fly really fast, take pictures, and don't get shot down. After the U-2, okay, we're faster than a speeding bullet. You can't get us now. The SR-71 is still in service with NASA. All right, another aircraft that had very simple requirements with the stealth fighter. The requirements: be stealthy, drop bombs, and don't get shot down. Do you see a trend here? Regrettably, one was shot down in Yugoslavia by an SA-3 anti-aircraft missiles because they didn't take into account when you opened the bomb doors, you could be seen on radar. Requirements changed again. So the next aircraft that we're going to look at is the F-35 Lightning. The requirements here are as follows: fly supersonic, be an intra-service, multi-mission capable solution for emerging global threats, leveraging fifth generation stealth, advanced electronic warfare, air to surface active, electronically scanned radar, fully integrated intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance using the next generation of core processor that can outperform and compute 400 billion operations a second, empowering electro-optical targeting system, providing 360 coverage while maintaining interoperability and legacy aircraft, full information sharing across all spectrums of warfare. Hmm. Yeah, how did that work out? Well, how that worked out was a DoD waterfall versus a DoD Agile. So I'm going to compare and contrast now the F-35 Lightning, which was $143 billion over budget, delayed a decade, cost the Navy a significant uplift of $337 million, and, well, basically was $31,000 a flight hour to keep in the air. Now, go across the Atlantic and look at the JAS 39 Gripen. Understandable that the capabilities of the ISR and processing are different, but from a perspective of a fighter, the entire cumulative program cost was $15 billion. The new iteration, because they use known stable interfaces in the construction, which was componentization, a strong part of agility, was able to change an engine or put avionics in every 6 months as long as you stayed within your parameters. The Gripen had a $43 million cost, 20% of the F-35, and it cost 4,000 hours or $4,000 an hour to keep in the air. Quite a difference. What drove this? Well, actually, software. So when you look at the F-16, it has minimal code. As you get up to the F-22 in the late 90s, code starts getting crazy. Once you get to the F-35 in 2012, it gets unwieldy. But what really drove it over the edge was all the operational support software that allowed interoperability. So, question two, why was the Skunk Works pattern of success and simplicity not able to deliver in the case of the F 35? Albert Einstein said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." So, we're going to transition into our third case study, and it's reducing the cost of space travel. In 1972, President Richard M. Nixon and NASA Administrator James Fletcher came together and sat down, and they committed to reducing the cost of launch vehicles and space aircraft by a factor of 10. So, before we go into this, let me just talk about some key variables of space exploration. There's mass, power, distance to travel, service life, communication, and the number of instruments. However, the number one cost of space exploration is people. So the first mission that we're going to look at is the Mars Polar Explorer. And we're going to look at it at the cost to deliver mass to Mars from the Earth. So the first stage kicks in. You have a blast off and you accelerate to 12,500 miles per hour. Second stage kicks in about 76 miles up, and the nitrohydrazine engines push you into orbit. Third stage kicks in, and it pushes you to Mars with orbital assist. Fourth stage, deceleration and the deployment of your landing parachute, and then final landing, floating down gently with your retro rockets. 550 pounds gets to the ground. Regrettably, in this case, the engine stopped early, and the Polar Explorer plummeted to its demise. That demise cost $16,437 an ounce. All right, so let's transition to a real success story. The Voyager reduced costs by a factor of three. And this is going back to the call for 10 times cheaper. So NASA wanted $1 billion for 4 spacecraft to tour the solar system. Congress appropriated $360 million for 2 spacecraft to visit Jupiter and Saturn. JPL built 2 spacecraft and visited 4 planets. They were launched in 1977, and Voyager is still working. The next mission we'll look at is the Spitzer Space Infrared Telescope. They reduced costs by a factor of 5. It was reduced size. The original estimate was 12,500 pounds, 2.2 billion to design, test, fabricate. The actual telescope was 1,650 pounds, 433 million to develop, and was launched in 2003, and it's still in a warm mode and could be brought back online. So the next mission that we're going to look at, well, wasn't really a mission, but was a space plane. And it was a joint venture of Lockheed Martin and NASA. So NASA threw in about $1 billion. Lockheed Martin threw in about a third of $1 billion. And they really pushed some innovative technology. They had an Aerospace engine. It's kind of like a scramjet, some graphite epoxy composite fuel tanks, and this super lightweight single stage to orbit technology. They pushed requirements to the edge of what technology was then, and ultimately it was canceled by NASA in 2001. It was just technological obstacles and growing costs. So, 1992, Dan Golden was the new NASA administrator. And what he did, he sat down and he looked at what worked and what didn't work. And he said, we are building a program called Faster, Better, Cheaper, the FBC program. So what it focused in was small missions, no more eggs in, no more all your eggs in one basket. It incorporated advanced technology. It reduced NASA headquarters oversight and pushed responsibility down to the centers where the people doing the work and were on the front lines made the decision. It constructed exciting visions and roadmaps. And he said it's okay to fail, which was not really well understood, but it was a key component for people looking to innovate. So, faster, better, cheaper boiled down to two basic things. It attempted to improve performance by being more efficient and more innovative, and it applied to everything and everyone at the agency. There is an intangible element and team spirit associated with doing FBC, and the people are the most important ingredient. There were 16 major missions with Faster, Better, Cheaper between 1992 and 1999. Far from backyard science projects, these were missions that were some of the most challenging things NASA ever attempted, including missions to Mars, missions to the moon, several Earth orbiting satellites, and even an asteroid rendezvous. Let's look at some of these missions and compare them to the past Big Bangs. So let's look at one of those big missions, the Cassini project, launched in 1997. It took 8 years to build. That's the same time to go to the moon. It took over a decade to build. It cost $3.3 billion, weighed over 12,000 pounds, and was the size of a yellow school bus. Uh, it was an orbiter and landing for one of Sanders' moons, and it successfully returned data. And it was the first ever landing on an outer body in the solar system. So let's compare faster, better, cheaper to the Cassini. So faster, better, cheaper established tight cost and schedule constraints. The total cost for all 16 missions was less than Cassini. 10 succeeded, including Pathfinder, the Near, Stardust. We'll talk about those. So that's kind of like a 10 for 1. Uh, by 1998, 9 of the first 10 missions had succeeded. Interesting. When you add up all the costs for all 16 missions, it's less than the total amount spent for managing the Cassini mission to Saturn. Think about that, 16 missions for the price of one. The next mission we're going to look at is a faster, better, cheaper mission called the Pathfinder, which was a mission to Mars. The Pathfinder mission was designed to last less than 1 month, but it went on for 3 years and collected 17,000 images, one of NASA's proudest moments in the decade. If you saw the Martian movie, you know this is what helped rescue Matt Damon, but it also did some really neat other stuff. So it's worth noting that Mars is fiendishly difficult to visit. Despite making 19 attempts, the Russians never or never reached the surface of the red planet intact. Not only did the Pathfinder team put a cutting edge hardware on the Mars, they did it faster, better, cheaper than the 1970s Viking mission. The Viking mission was a $3.6 billion 6 year, 2,257 people. Pathfinder was a fraction of that and took 3 years and a handful, 350 people. Okay, the next mission we're going to look at is the NEAR mission, the Near Earth Asteroid Rendezvous mission. The Near asteroid mission was to send a probe out to Eros and create a close orbit for a period of a year. So the NEAR's budget was $200 million. This was one of the first time that they had a cost underrun. In this case, it was $78 million less than what they projected. Now, here on the other side is a visual representation of how much data they expected to collect. And this is how much they actually did collect, a tenfold increase. So the scorecard, faster, better, cheaper results from 1992 to 1998, a 10 to 1 success, one loss. But here's an interesting thing. As they pushed on, the investigation showed that the first missions were successful. That success led to politics and increased requirements, shorter time boxes, the stretch to do better. With these additional requirements and constraint, the latter missions failed. because they deviated from the FBC guidelines. All right. Question number 3. What working agreement, like faster, better, cheaper, could help prevent these failures, or at least set a minimum uh, level set of failure within acceptable limits, not only for NASA, but within your organization? So think about it. Your mission success rate greater than 8 out of 10, the degree to which both launch spacecraft costs are reduced, the number of peer reviewed scientific papers published resulting from those NASA missions, the degree of which an effective NASA technology development is shared with the civilian sector. Many different ways to look at what success is. So now we're going to shift into a radical realm of simplicity. CubeSats. So simplicity, less stuff, less work, less expense equals more money, more time, more joy. Less equals more. So I'm going to take you back to when Bob and Jordy were working out in California. And they presented this idea back in the summer of 1999. And again, at the US Science Technology Program Conference, they had a standard of 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters and no more than 1.3 kilograms of mass to standardize microsatellites, basically fractionalizing space. So what they said is, hey, we have a cell phone. It has structure, power, charging, video attitude center, sensor, computer, communications, a GPS, a motion sensor, and a camera. Wow, that's a microsatellite. Okay, this is one of the first CubeSats. It's a cell phone in a box with an antenna made from a tape measure, like for real. It was made by a college student, and it flies overhead still today, and it will respond with text via a HF radio. Who cares? I don't know. It's cool, but it was like the Wright brothers' first flight. It set a future for a fractionalized CubeSat future. So 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 unit, 4. They used a incremental increase based on mass and size. Let's look back over spacecraft sizes in history. So when you go all the way back to like the Explorer 1, it was 14 kilograms. Uh, as you moved into small satellites, into manned missions, the weight got crazy. Once you got up to the space shuttle, you're looking at 14,000 kilograms, able to fly into space, be delivered, and then come back. So, what the professors designed was the picosatellite orbital deployer called PPOD. And it had standard attach points. It could strap onto a spacecraft with a pre-designed, specified center of gravity and weight. So it was used as equivalents of ballast for the flight, making use of what really would have been just weights. That was incredibly simple. It had a 6-page specification. It was spring-loaded, and it had a standard interface. Incredibly simple. Here's a picture of it on the Japanese module of the space shuttle deploying several microsatellites. It's kind of interesting. The ULA uses these Peapods as ballast, and they give out free rides to space to universities all around the world. So these microsatellites even have micromotors that can get them around, small ion engines that can position them throughout their orbit. With this technology, once they're launched, they have those micromotors to get them around. They've gone many places. The space sail to outer space, Mercury, Mars, the moon, and multiple missions around the Earth. We'll look at how many now. So when the shuttle retired, all of a sudden, there are a whole bunch more CubeSat missions that go out. But what's interesting is that the breakdown of the early missions were, well, university, and then it shifted drastically to commercial. A whole bunch of suppliers now are in the game. And what they provide are off the shelf uh, components. So in our software world, this is called open source. But you can buy a ground station, set it up for a price of a luxury car, then um, go out and buy everything that you need to support your mission. Why are folks looking at missions now? Well, the space shuttle and many of the other launch vehicles were retiring at that time. This was before SpaceX, and exploration missions were all going to be unmanned. And in looking at that, that better, faster, cheaper philosophy applied. All right, here's our last question. So, how can componentization and simplicity be applied in your business? And how can you be a part of making this change? Some lessons to reflect on. The Wright brothers' dream and learning from lots of little experiments. Samuel Langley's focus on self and not the mission. The Skunk Works, getting lost in a sea of complexity after its success. The elegance of simplicity as applied to CubeSats. You know, SpaceX is the next step in this evolution. And what I would say, their iterative experimentation and innovation leverages many of the lessons presented here today. My parting invitation to you and your teams is to learn from those who have gone before you and learn from history to prevent becoming a cautionary tale. So I'll close with what the NASA Faster, Better, Cheaper Task Force said. The key now is implementation. This requires careful planning, lots of work. This requires unprecedented teaming and open, candid communication. No one person has the answer. It takes debate and evolution of ideas to get there. It takes courage to admit a wrong path and the need to move in another direction. I would invite you all to imbibe this in your current present reality. Thank you for joining me on this reflection of agility in aerospace. Please feel free to contact me on LinkedIn if you have any questions or just want to follow up. Cheers.